Before I start, I have to give a trigger warning, as this episode covers the topic of child abuse, and some may find this quite upsetting. Equally, if you go on to read the book Where There Is Evil by Sandra Brown, where I got most of the information for this episode from, but wasn't able to include everything, please be aware that it also covers the topic of child abuse, so listener and reader discretion is advised. We ended part 1 with Sandra having confronted her father, Alex, following the death of his mother, having not seen nor spoken to him for 27 years. Sandra had perhaps expected to feel relieved, lighter even, at having been finally able to say what she wanted to her father, say how he had made her feel growing up. However, when she left her grand's house, where her dad was staying, she felt anything but relieved, believing now that her father had somehow been involved in 11-year-old Moira Anderson's disappearance. She knew in her heart that she couldn't sit on the information her father had told her that night, couldn't get away from the feeling that her father had potentially been involved in Moira Anderson's disappearance. She felt sure he had lied when he said that he'd been interviewed at the time of Moira's disappearance by the police, and if she could help bring answers to Moira's family, then she knew she would if she could. Sandra could not have known just what she was to discover on her journey to try and get justice for Moira, and she also could not have known just how many people, including her brothers and her mother, did not want the family secrets she had uncovered to be brought out into the open. The book, Where There Is Evil, goes into great detail about the journey Sandra found herself on after realising that her father could have been involved in Moira Anderson's murder, and it was a fascinating read, but I obviously wasn't able to mention everything in this episode, but I have included as much as I can. For months after her conversation with her father, Sandra could think of nothing else, with the revelation by her father weighing heavily on Sandra, and it began to affect her health and mental health, eventually culminating in Sandra being in a car accident due to lack of concentration. Sandra hadn't felt able to discuss what had happened with her mother due to the funeral of Sandra's granny Jenny, Alex's mum, being arranged, and her mother's health not being very good, but she needed someone to speak to, and so she eventually spoke to her mum's sister, her Aunt Margaret, and asked her if she could remember whether her father had been interviewed by the police at the time of Moira's disappearance. Sandra was surprised when her aunt immediately replied that yes, he definitely had been interviewed. But how could Margaret be so sure? It was such a long time ago. But Margaret said she remembered it clearly because she had been at Sandra's home with her mother about a week after Moira's disappearance, when her father had come home and said that he was to go to the police station to give a statement, as a witness had told the police that she'd seen Moira get on the bus shortly after 4 p.m. and that Alex had been the driver. She remembers this so well, as Sandra's mum had been furious, wondering what trouble Sandra's dad was in now, as he was at that time on bail, charged with the sexual assault of their 13-year-old babysitter, Betty. But Alex told Sandra's mum and her aunt that no, he wasn't in any trouble. The woman had made a mistake. It hadn't been Moira Anderson who had gotten on his bus that day, but a Moira Liddell. He had apparently then gone to the police station, located just across the street from their home, to make this statement, and was back home within an hour saying it was all sorted, to which Sandra's mum was so relieved. However, Sandra's Aunt Margaret then went on to say that despite this, and apparently the police ruling him out of their investigation, when Alex's dad heard that someone had seen Moira getting onto his bus, he was furious, believing that as his son was already out on bail for sexual offences against Betty, that it was likely he had something to do with Moira's disappearance too. Alex's dad and his wife, Sandra's granny Jenny, turned up at their son Alex's home and confronted Alex, ignoring him when he denied any involvement, and instead they began ripping up floorboards throughout the house, removing newly installed units in the kitchen to check behind them, searching the whole house and even Alex's car and his bus, and upon finding no trace of Moira, turned to Sandra's dad and said, "You tell the police where you put that wee lassie, Alex." However, Alex continued to deny any involvement in Moira's disappearance and stuck to the story that it was a different Moira that had been seen getting onto his bus that day, saying that, "You know I'd never harm any Wayne." Despite hearing this and being assured by friends and family that surely Alex wouldn't have been missed in the initial investigation, especially as he was on bail for sexual offences against a child, Sandra had to be sure. With Sandra's health having deteriorated so significantly by this time, she knew she needed to deal with the situation, and so she began to see a counsellor, where she could finally talk freely and get her thoughts in order. At which point she knew she had to go to the police with what her father had told her, knowing full well that a lot of her family members would be horrified by this decision. Sandra firstly spoke to a police officer friend of hers and explained the situation in the hope that he would be able to check the records to see if her father had or had not been interviewed back in 1957. However, her friend told her that he would not be able to do this as he was not on the relevant team, but he agreed to pass on Sandra's concerns to a colleague that he trusted and that they would contact Sandra directly to discuss further. It was a few days later, when Sandra was visited by Detective Inspector Jim McEwen, that her worst fears were realised. Detective McEwen told Sandra that he had been through Moira's inquiry file from 1957 and he could confirm that there was absolutely no mention of Alexander Gartshaw ever being interviewed, either at the time of Moira's disappearance or thereafter. It was at this point that the detective also revealed that despite there having been numerous sightings of Moira, either near or on the bus, after the last confirmed sighting of her, the decision at the time had been made not to reveal this to the public. 4 independent statements were dismissed, despite 2 statements being from police officers' wives. Another decision that was made at the time by the 2 detectives in charge, Detectives MacDonald and McIntosh, was not to interview the driver of the bus, with only a cursory question being asked to a random, unknown employee who happened to be there when a visit was made to Baxter's buses depot. Sandra could not believe what she was hearing. Why had these witnesses and statements, 2 of which were by police officers' wives, been dismissed? And why was her father, the bus driver of the bus Moira was seen on by 4 separate individuals, never questioned? Detective McEwen couldn't give Sandra an answer, but he did state that the fact 2 statements were by police officers' wives would have meant absolutely nothing. Detective McEwen went on to disclose that the only one of the 4 witnesses who was still alive was James Inglis, who was by then a pensioner. The detective said that he had already spoken to James, though, and that he had stood by every word of his statement from back in 1957. Detective McEwen then asked Sandra to tell him the whole story from the beginning. At this point, it hit Sandra that she was being taken seriously. She was about to make a formal statement. Her father had lied, and Moira Anderson's disappearance was going to be reinvestigated. Despite an 11-year-old girl going missing mysteriously for no apparent reason, foul play had been ruled out, and Moira's case, which had never been closed, had remained as a missing person inquiry. However, Detective McEwen told Sandra that after hearing what she had to say and going through Moira's file, he was convinced that foul play had occurred. Now he intended to gather as much information as possible by retaking statements from those still alive, including from Betty, who Alex had sexually abused when she was 13 years old, and the former Detective Inspector John MacDonald, who had led Moira's missing person inquiry back in 1957, as well as speaking to people who had been living in the area where Moira went missing back in 1957, who were still living in the area now, before he then would be going to speak to Sandra's dad, Alex, in Leeds. Detective McEwen assured Sandra that it would be a while before he visited her father, which Sandra was thankful for, as she had as yet not told her mother of what she had started in motion. However, Detective McEwen would soon ask Sandra a question that would lead her to being hypnotized in order to be able to truly answer his question, and it would lead to Sandra uncovering more shocking secrets that, up until then, her family members had never dared talk about. When Detective McEwen spoke with the detective who had led Moira's missing person inquiry back in 1957, former Detective Inspector MacDonald, and told him what Sandra had come forward with, he said that he was shocked, being adamant that Alexander Gartshaw couldn't possibly have been involved in Moira's disappearance, as he stopped his bus for all the old ladies and dropped them at their gates, and the kiddies all gave him sweets. He also advised that he had no recollection of Alexander Gartshaw ever having been in any kind of trouble, going on to say that he in fact had been convinced that a man called Ian Simpson was responsible for Moira's disappearance. Ian Simpson would have been about 21 years old at the time Moira went missing in 1957. While he didn't live in the area, his sister lived near the co-op shop where Moira had been sent on an errand the day she went missing. However, Ian's sister had insisted that he had not been visiting her at the time of Moira's disappearance, and in fact he had been away with the Territorial Army, which was confirmed following Ian being questioned, and he was subsequently officially ruled out, although it appears that the lead detective continued to believe he had been involved in Moira's disappearance. What is interesting, though, is that Ian Simpson went on to murder 2 men in Scotland in 1962. However, he never stood trial as he was deemed mentally unfit, and instead was sent to Scotland's psychiatric hospital, Carstairs. And in 1976, after being detained there for 14 years, he was brutally and savagely murdered by 2 fellow patients, Thomas McCulloch and Robert Moan, during their escape from the hospital. So there was a possibility he could have killed before. However, he apparently had a cast iron alibi. But we now know that the inquiry into Moira's disappearance was anything but thorough. So had Ian Simpson slipped through the net somehow? Following Detective McEwen speaking with former Detective Inspector MacDonald and him stating he had no recollection of Alex ever being in trouble, despite the fact Alex had been charged with having carnal knowledge of a minor and other offences of a sexual nature, and this being reported in local newspapers, as well as the police being fully aware of who Alex was due to the understanding between police officers and the bus drivers around Coatbridge regarding the police not paying for their fare and in return turning a blind eye to any untoward behaviour. Detective McEwen wondered if this was why the police had, in essence, turned a blind eye to Alex's behaviour, to simply uphold an understanding between the local police and bus drivers. Detective McEwen then visited Betty, who had been Sandra and her brother's babysitter and who had been raped by Alex Gartshaw when she was 13, and he took a statement from her about the horrific sexual abuse she had suffered at the hands of Alex Gartshaw. Betty told Detective McEwen that she had not been promiscuous, as Alex's solicitor had tried to suggest back in 1957, but that she had been forced into sexual intercourse by Alex the first time, but that thereafter she had consented, and that the sexual encounters usually took place near a park where Moira Anderson and many other children would play, and that he would give her money to keep her quiet. Following speaking to Betty, Detective McEwen began to think, what if Betty had not been Alex's only victim, but instead was the only one who had actually spoken out? Could there have been other children who had been sexually abused by Alex Gartshaw? And just how close to home could this abuse have occurred? When Detective McEwen next saw Sandra, he asked her the question that, up until then, had never even crossed Sandra's mind, but soon she would not be able to think of anything else. He asked, "Are you absolutely sure, Sandra, that nothing happened to you?" Sandra immediately answered, "No, absolutely not." But over the next few months, this question haunted Sandra, terrified that she was in fact suppressing this memory. However, before Sandra had time to fully explore this thought, Detective McEwen asked another shocking question. Was Alex in contact with any other young female relatives back in the 50s? Again, Sandra was adamant that no, it was her friends that Alex had molested. Her female cousins were much too young for this to have happened to them. Plus, if something had happened, there was no way it would have been kept quiet. The whole family would know about it. No, Detective McEwen was barking up the wrong tree there. But was he? With the reinvestigation gathering momentum, Detective McEwen asked Sandra to accompany him to show him what the layout of the area where Moira had gone missing looked like back in the 1950s, what had been the route the bus her father was driving the day Moira went missing would have gone, and if there were any places she could think of her father frequented at the time where he could possibly have disposed of Moira's body. Both Sandra and the detective agreed that it was unlikely her father would have travelled far that day if he were to dispose of Moira's body due to the weather conditions. You'd think that might narrow areas down, but it didn't, as Coatbridge was packed with old coal mines, lochs, marshland, and a canal even ran right through the area back in the 50s. Although Sandra did remember a time when she was about 4 or 5 and her dad had taken her to a loch where he had played as a child. He told her that there was a mine shaft underneath the loch and that no one knew how deep it went, and that, if ever I wanted rid of something, that's where I'd put it. Sandra, even at the young age of 4 or 5, remembered being scared when he said this. Could this have been Moira's final resting place? Now, while police in Scotland are looking into Alex, they also contacted Yorkshire Police, the police who covered the area where Alex was living in Leeds, to see if they could add anything of interest. However, while Alex was known to police in Leeds, as he had been charged with deception and fraud, he was not a known paedophile, and despite Leeds apparently being known to have the biggest paedophile ring in Britain, no complaints had been made about Alex in this regard. While Sandra was initially relieved to hear this, thinking, thank God he's no longer molesting children, she then thought, well, just because the police don't know about it doesn't mean he's not been or is still doing this, as it was only now that the sexual abuse he had inflicted on children back in the 1950s was coming out. But as yet, Sandra had no idea just how much was still to come out, but she was about to find out. Sandra began to make a list of her female cousins on her mother's side, who would have been living in the same area as Sandra and her family back in the 50s and 60s, and eventually concluded that there would have been 6 girls, 3 sets of sisters, who would have been aged between 3 to 14 years old when Alex Gartshaw left Coatbridge for England with his mistress. Sandra initially contacted her aunt, who was the mother of 2 of her female cousins, just to ask for advice about how to handle the situation. But after Sandra had explained the situation, her aunt was quiet, eventually saying that Sandra should speak to her eldest daughter privately before hanging up. Sandra immediately called this cousin, who she had always been close with, and arranged to go to her house to talk. When Sandra asked her cousin if her father had ever been sexually inappropriate with her, her cousin looked her straight in the eye and said yes. She went on to say that this had occurred when she was 6 years old. She told Sandra that one sunny afternoon her mother had taken her and her younger sister to Sandra's mum's house, where a number of adults were in the garden having afternoon tea. She said her and her sister had gone off to play and had seen Sandra's dad working in the garage attached to the house. She said he had coaxed her into the garage by asking her to come and hold something. She said something just didn't feel right and she was reluctant, but he had persuaded her. As she got closer, she saw something protruding from his boiler suit and froze with shock. She was within arm's distance from Sandra's dad at this point, and he was telling her to come closer and hold this electrical cable for him, but she was rooted to the spot until she heard her younger sister approaching and asking to see what was going on. Sandra's cousin said that this jolted her, and she turned, grabbed her sister's hand, and told her to run. Sandra couldn't believe it, but asked her why she hadn't told her mum what had happened. But she had, and she'd been told never to repeat such lies again. Sandra's cousin told her that she had received counselling as an adult, which had helped. Sandra was incensed that her cousin's mum hadn't believed her, even after Alex had been found guilty for sexually abusing his children's babysitter, and so she called her to ask her why she didn't believe her child and had called her a liar. Her aunt said that she thought it might have been a mistake about Betty and that she felt sure Alex would have learned his lesson. However, she also admitted that Sandra's mum had been through so much with her husband and that she just couldn't put her through any more pain by believing and revealing what her own child had told her, ending by saying, "Some things are better left alone." With Sandra now having spoken to one set of her cousins and heard what they had to say, she arranged for them all to meet up, hoping that she had already heard the worst that her father had done to her much younger cousins. Another set of sisters also disclosed that they both had been victims of Sandra's dad for several years, although they hadn't realised the other was being abused until much later. One of the sisters disclosed that when she had been about 7 or 8, Alex would push her into a dark cupboard and molest her on more than one occasion. She would also go on car rides with him, excited to have been chosen out of all the other children, feeling special, only to be molested. Again, she had told her mother what had happened when she reached her teenage years, but again her mother found this hard to believe, telling her daughter just to forget it. She went on to tell Sandra, "He took away all my innocence. It was wicked. He touched me everywhere." So really, it was everything except actual penetration. This trauma affected Sandra's cousin all her life. She gets triggered by little things, and it brings these awful memories right back. And the abuse she suffered has affected relationships she has had. This cousin's sister then quietly said that she too had been sexually abused by Sandra's dad, from when she was around 7 years old until she was 10. Again, after the first time it happened, she told her gran, but her gran became angry at her and told her to stop making things up. Another time when she told her gran took her inside and gave her a biscuit and a cuddle. At this point, the other cousins agreed that they too had told Sandra's mum's mum, their granny, and had been told to wheesht. None of them could understand why Alex's mother-in-law would have continued to keep this quiet when a number of her grandchildren had told her the same thing had been happening to them. And then a fifth cousin began crying, before saying that despite her being about 4 years old when Sandra's father left Coatbridge, she too had been sexually abused by him, remembering how tall he was and him wearing his bus driver uniform. With all but one of Sandra's female cousins having been abused by her father, again Sandra was asked the uncomfortable question, was she sure she hadn't been sexually abused by him? Sandra needed to know the answer to this question, and so agreed to go under hypnosis. But before Sandra could arrange for this to take place, she started to receive increasingly aggressive phone calls from family members, close and distant, who had by then began to hear murmurings about what Sandra was doing, the questions she was asking, and when she told them what her father had said and how she believed he had been responsible for Moira's disappearance and likely murder, she was threatened, told she was stupid, that she should just have ignored what he said, that he was blood, he was family, that she would regret it, and her actions would hurt her family. But Sandra was resolute, and she also had support from other family members, and her cousins had agreed to give a statement to Detective McEwen about the abuse they had suffered at the hands of Alex Gartshaw. So a case against this man was slowly but surely building, and now the lid had been lifted, more and more people began to open up about their abuse at the hands of Sandra's dad, following Sandra contacting female friends she had back when she was a child, with one friend who had been 12 at the time saying that despite her trying desperately to avoid ever being in Alex's presence, as he had been inappropriate towards her before, on one occasion when she called at Sandra's door for her to come out and play, her father answered, and he pretended that Sandra was upstairs and said that she should go up. Reluctantly, she did, only to be pushed into a bedroom and bent over a bed. She said he gave her money afterwards to keep her quiet. She also said that when she told her sister what had happened, her sister called her a whore and refused to speak to her from that day onwards. This friend had only recently started counselling, having spent so many years addicted to drugs and alcohol in an attempt to block out what had happened to her. Many more of Sandra's friends back in the 1950s and 60s had their own stories to tell about the abuse they suffered as children, but understandably not many were willing to give statements to the police, preferring it to stay in the past. Despite Sandra receiving many calls from angry family members who had heard that Sandra had been to the police about her dad and was asking female members of her family about any abuse they may have suffered as children, as like back when the abuse by Alex's dad took place, it appeared that nobody had dared tell Sandra's mum anything about what had happened. And so when Sandra eventually sat down with her mum and told her about the sexual abuse inflicted by Alex towards young members of the family, as well as telling her what he had said about Moira, Sandra's mum was furious, denying this and shouting he had nothing to do with Moira. He was interviewed and he was cleared. Even when Sandra quietly told her mother that no, he had never been interviewed by the police about Moira, let alone cleared, her mother didn't want to hear, couldn't hear, putting her hands to her ears and saying it was all lies. While Sandra's mum initially refused to speak to Sandra, after thinking about things, she told Sandra that while she didn't necessarily agree with what Sandra was doing and that she didn't want to know anything about it, she wouldn't let what her father had or hadn't done come between them. Although she did tell Sandra that after Moira had gone missing, she had received an anonymous letter which said that Betty was not the only child that Alex was interfering with, that there were dozens of others, and that she should take her children and leave, with the letter ending by saying, "He won't stop with the lassie Anderson." Sandra's mum said she took this letter to the police station after speaking to her dad, but that no police officer ever came to speak to her, and her mother just told her to forget it. As Christmas 1992 came around, while Sandra was still putting off finding out if she too had been a victim of sexual abuse by her father, 4 of her cousins had now given their statements to the police, and Detective McEwen told Sandra that he planned to interview her father in the new year, which was great news as this was now causing a huge rift within the family, and even Sandra's 2 brothers were questioning the validity of their cousin's allegations. It wouldn't be until the 17th of March 1993 that Detective Inspector McEwen and his superior officer, Detective Chief Inspector Gray, travelled to Leeds to interview Alex Gartshore. After Alex Gartshore being interviewed for 2 days, the 2 detectives then travelled back to Glasgow, and Detective McEwen advised Sandra that she had been absolutely correct about her dad having been responsible for Moira's disappearance, and that he was convinced Alex Gartshore was their man. Sandra was so relieved, but she wanted to know what had convinced the detectives of this, to which Detective McEwen said it was his intuition, as well as Alex's reaction when he had been shown a photo of Moira. Detective McEwen said Alex had immediately recognised her after over 30 years had elapsed, and after saying that he had not known her. Sandra was also surprised, but pleased, to hear that her father had not denied the conversation they had had in her granny's bedroom after her death. He agreed that everything Sandra had told the police was correct, although he strongly implied that Sandra was just bitter that he had abandoned her and moved to Leeds to start a new family, and that this was just Sandra looking for vengeance. The decision was made to not interview Alex any further at that time. However, that didn't stop an article appearing in a local Coatbridge paper that stated a man had been interviewed about Moira Anderson's disappearance, a man that was not questioned by detectives during the original investigation. It was also revealed, for the first time to the public in this newspaper, that Moira had not just vanished into thin air that Saturday afternoon, but had in fact been seen on or near a bus by 4 separate witnesses, although the article went on to say that 3 out of the 4 witnesses were now dead. The article also asked for anyone who had any information to please contact the police. And this seemed to be working, as the police had received a number of calls that they were following up, including one from a Baxter's bus employee who said he believed he knew the man the papers were saying had been interviewed in connection with Moira's disappearance, and that he wanted to make a statement, as he had suspected this man for many years. Former police officers who had been involved in Moira's missing person inquiry also came forward, and they said that they all knew at the time who Alex was and that he was well known to be a flasher, being known to flash children at a nearby park. Cinema staff from back in the 50s also came forward to say that he was known to attend the cinema alone and sit beside women who were also alone, or beside children, and that while many of the women could handle his unwanted advances, the children he sat beside were noted to sit stiff, unsure of what to do about what was happening to them. Sandra's mum and Aunt Margaret also made statements to the police about the day Moira went missing, and Alex stating to them that he had been interviewed by the police about Moira, as witnesses had said he'd been seen talking to her on the bus, but that he said everything had been cleared up, as it had been a Moira Liddell he had been talking to, not a Moira Anderson. However, when this had been checked out, while there were families with the surname Liddell in the area, there had been no one called Moira or similar in the same age group. It had to be Moira Anderson that Alex Gartshore had been seen talking to. It was noted after statements had been taken from Sandra's mum, Betty, the babysitter, who had spoken to Alex the very day Moira went missing on his bus, and Sandra's dad, that there were inconsistencies around how and when Sandra's dad, Alex, had heard about Moira's disappearance. Alex had insisted that he had heard about Moira being missing on the night of her disappearance, saying that people were talking about it on the bus that evening. But Betty's statement said that when she had asked Alex what he was doing on the Saturday evening, he told her that he wasn't working that night, but that he had plans to go out for the evening, but not with her or Sandra's mum. And Sandra's mum's statement said that Alex had finished on the buses late on the Saturday night, had gone to the chip shop after, and was home about 11:45 p.m. And this was when he told Sandra's mum about Moira being missing. However, Moira wasn't actually reported missing until midnight. And while Alex had said in his statement that he hadn't known Moira, that she was just another child that had got on and off his bus, despite recognising her photograph immediately, Sandra's mum said in her statement that he had told her that he had seen Moira from his bus on the day she had gone missing, and that she had apparently been sweeping the street outside her home, and that she had waved at Alex. Armed with these inconsistencies, as well as many previous employees of Baxter's buses who had been employed at the same time as Alex, coming forward to give damning statements, including one man who said that Alex was known for picking up girls who'd just left school, and another saying that Alex was attracted to wee lassies, schoolgirls, not older ones. They were always on his bus, and he was known to be interfering with them sexually. And many saying that at the time of Moira's disappearance, there was speculation amongst the employees that Alex had killed Moira. Detective McEwen and his superior travelled once again to Leeds to interview Alex Gartshaw. During this interview, Alex backtracked about it being a Moira Liddell he had been speaking to on the day of Moira Anderson's disappearance, saying now that he did actually know the Anderson family and Moira and her mother especially. But he maintained that he had been interviewed by the police at the time of Moira's disappearance, when they had spoken to him at the bus depot, and he had told them all this, and that it had been cleared up, despite there being no record of him ever being interviewed. But then there was a breakthrough. Alex had gone from not knowing Moira to it being a Moira Liddell that had got on his bus that day, not a Moira Anderson, to then admitting to knowing Moira and her mum, to then saying that Moira had got on his bus that day about 4:10 p.m. at the bus stop near her home, and that he had spoken to her, and she had told him that she was going into town to get her mum a birthday card, as it was her birthday the very next day. This was new information, and when checked it was found out that yes, it was Moira's mum's birthday the day after she disappeared. She had spent her 40th birthday searching for her wee girl. Alexander Gartshaw had just placed Moira on his bus. Alex quickly realised his mistake and began to backtrack again, saying that he had heard this information about the card from passengers on his bus weeks later, but it was too late. It was out there. The reason that Moira got on that bus was now known. Plus, during those who had been around at the time Moira had disappeared being re-interviewed, including staff at the co-op, where Moira had been sent for an errand, admitted that they had lied during the initial investigation, and they had actually closed early that day due to the weather. So when Moira had arrived at the co-op, she would have found it closed. She would have had no option but to get on a bus and go into town. If only that shop had not closed early. After this, Alex just dug a deeper hole. He said that he had told the police this when they had come to interview him at the bus depot. Then he said that he had found out about Moira going into town for a card and being missing at 7:30 p.m. on the Saturday when a passenger told him. Then he said he had heard about Moira being missing at 9 p.m. on the Saturday. Then it was 10 p.m. on the Saturday, despite Moira not being reported missing until nearly midnight, and it being confirmed with close family members who were around at the time that only immediate family and a handful of neighbours knew about Moira being missing until Sunday when search parties were organised. Alex just kept on digging. By this time, news of a man being interviewed and new information being received was featured in more and more newspapers and news programmes, and now Moira's sisters Janet in Australia and Marjorie in England were anxious to see the mystery of their sister's disappearance finally be solved. Sadly, Moira's father had died in 1992, just before the reinvestigation into her disappearance became official in March 1993. He never knew that his daughter may finally be going to receive justice. Despite many people coming forward with information, due to the passage of time, at least 9 potentially important witnesses had since died. However, on the 18th of May 1993, Alexander Gartshaw was arrested on suspicion of Moira Anderson's murder, and then he was quickly released on bail. As well as this, Moira's cousins waited anxiously to find out if their statements regarding their childhood sexual abuse by Alex would be taken any further by the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. In the meantime, back in Coatbridge, divers began searching a pond that had been pinpointed as possibly being where Moira's body was, after Sandra had introduced a psychic she had been to Detective McEwen, a psychic who'd been able to tell Sandra a lot of things about her family and Moira Anderson's disappearance that no one else would know. Sadly, though, this search proved fruitless, but more disappointment was to follow. A decision had been made by the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, and it wasn't good. Despite Alex Gartshaw admitting he had abused 2 of Sandra's cousins, and he had 5 charges against him in regard to lewd and libidinous behaviour against Sandra's 5 cousins, and while the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service acknowledged this and the work that had been undertaken in the reinvestigation of Moira's case, had decided that there be no further proceedings. No reasons were given for this decision. Detective McEwen immediately arranged for a meeting to take place between the Procurator Fiscal and Sandra, as he knew Sandra wouldn't just leave it at that. She would want answers. However, Sandra not only didn't get any answers, she was also met with hostility. She was told by the Procurator Fiscal that it was a long-standing tradition that the Crown Office never give reasons for their decisions, but that it had been decided not to proceed with what had happened to her cousins, as it was not in the public interest. Obviously, Sandra strongly disagreed with this, and explained to him the trauma her cousins and others had been through, but she continued to be met with resistance. When she tried to explain that if Alex was charged with this crime and brought back to Scotland, then perhaps they would even receive a confession from him about Moira's murder. To which the Procurator Fiscal said that Moira Anderson's case was still a missing person inquiry, and that without a body there was no murder, despite in a couple of cases a murder trial having taken place without a body being found. He ended by saying that the case was no further forward than it had been in 1957. He then blindsided Sandra by asking her to explain what these women hoped to gain from taking to the stand and testifying to the sickening acts that Alex had carried out on them. Why would they want to do this? Anger soared through Sandra as she said, "Justice." The rest of the conversation went much the same. Sandra got nowhere, with the Procurator Fiscal's parting gift being to say that sordid things happen to all of us, and that child abuse cases he was currently working on were much worse than what Sandra's relatives had suffered. While Sandra did complain to the Crown Office, she was fobbed off with them saying that the decision had been made and they were not at liberty to disclose why it had been made. And as there was no independent body to complain to regarding the Scottish legal system, the options for Sandra were to go public or pay through the nose to address the issue privately. And so Sandra contacted a local reporter, Eileen Macaulay, who had been covering the reinvestigation relentlessly, and the pair arranged to meet. Little did Sandra and Eileen know that by them teaming up, it would lead to a further confrontation with Alex Gartshaw, and a taped and deathbed confession. But would it be Alex's deathbed confession? That's the end of part 2, but join me next time to find out if the taped confession would lead to the Crown Office changing their views and Alexander being charged and arrested for Moira Anderson's murder, when finally Moira's status is changed from missing to murdered. Also, find out what the unprecedented move by the Crown Office was. But was it too little, too late?
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.